There's a lot of things we can discuss and argue about the Total War Warhammer trilogy by Creative Assembly, some of which are pretty subjective topics, such as how good the game is in general compared to the old Total War titles, or how accurate units and legendary lords are compared to the lore. Give or take, the answer to these topics may vary from person to person. I hate the games myself. I am done with them. I am done with Creative Assembly after years of putting up with their bullshit. However, if I see newcomers getting into the franchise, having a good time with the game, I don't mind them. Good for them. It's not my job or obligation to tell them what they should or shouldn't like. It's their own money they are throwing away. However, on the topic of subjective and objective flaws, there is an objective observation anyone with common sense will be able to conclude. The answer to the question, is Creative Assembly and its Warhammer games woke? To me, this was always obvious, but I don't really see anyone else talk about it publicly. Creative Assembly is pretty open about what kind of politics they follow as a company. Without going too far, they invested £100 million into a game whose main premise was anti-capitalism. Obviously, they are a bunch of hypocrites, since the game itself was gonna be loaded with microtransactions and be built around the concept of games as a service. In case someone doesn't know what games as a service means, it's basically when a video game is developed with the idea of milking the consumer of their money at every given chance. These games are distributed and commercialized as free, but in reality they are anything but. Want to have a cool looking alternative outfit for your character? Pay up. Want some kind of power up or cool items? Pay up. Want to progress faster? Pay up. The sky is the limit on how you want to scam or trick your consumer base. Through these methods, corporations can psychologically manipulate unprepared customers into spending a lot more money than if they just bought the product at a standard price with all its features. Games like Fortnite, League of Legends, those weird anime mobile gacha games, these are all examples of how lucrative this business model can be, and how predatory and harmful it is for the average person. We're talking about people spending real hundreds, if not thousands of dollars on cosmetics or super rare characters that can only be unlocked on a limited time basis. And these are just a few examples. As I said, the sky's the limit. Needless to say, this is peak snake oil capitalism. So how do companies like Creative Assembly associate themselves with leftist and liberal movements when they are the exact same evil they are trying to fight against? I don't fucking know. The audacity to even try pulling any woke crap knowing exactly what kind of record they have is beyond me. Anyway, I'm explaining all of this to build an accurate public image of what kind of company we're dealing with whenever we talk about Creative Assembly. These guys are liars and manipulators, plain and simple. They are not better than Electronic Arts, Blizzard, or Ubisoft. Recently, I happen to have had a discussion online in a space where most people will pride themselves as being the noticer stereotype. I'm talking about a space where most of the users there lost their absolute shit when that Korean game Stellar Blade ended up slightly censored. Personally, I don't have a dog in that fight. To me, over-sexualized characters are just as stupid as the woke and ugly ones. Difference is, one is meant to be used as a commercial tool and a source of escapism, whereas the other is political propaganda that's got no place at all in the entertainment industry. It's 101 communist tactics. If you talk about Warhammer, regardless of what aspect of the hobby you're referring to, you're gonna end up talking about its lore, and that's exactly where things went. There's currently a shitstorm of controversy surrounding Warhammer 40k and Games Workshop, which was brought up when someone said at least they can't do anything to Warhammer Fantasy since it's discontinued, and that's where I intervene. I said, well, that's not true. Creative Assembly holds the master master key to Warhammer Fantasy, they can expand the lore in any way and form they so choose. And most of the time, whenever they come up with something original, it tends to be woke garbage. I thought I wasn't saying anything new, but it did trigger a bunch of people there. Most of them were eager to know, how is Warhammer 3 woke? My first reaction was, how the fuck is it not? I mean, over the years, while working on the Warhammer games, every time Creative Assembly has come up with an original piece of lore or characters, and especially if that character was female, it's been some ugly ass unit or stereotypical strong female character. And even though I presented my case with examples, they kept arguing that Warhammer Fantasy under the care of Creative Assembly simply isn't woke at all. And I want to give an example of why they didn't think it was the case. And I quote, "How is CA woke? They don't even have blacks." This isn't really a racist remark in its entirety, it's just a crude way of saying there's no token blacks or minorities in the game, therefore it's not woke. And this is when the idea for this video came to me, because unless it's a hot topic, generally speaking, most people are unable to form a solid opinion on anything. This is how you get these types of selective outrage individuals on either side of the political compass that will die on a hill fighting against censorship for a Coomer character in a game they don't really give a shit about, or lose their minds when Games Workshop breaks their own lore by introducing female custodians. So long as they hear it from somebody else, someone with status, they will adopt a stance. But before that, they're just loose cattle. Feel free to disagree with me all you want, but don't be like these people. Either have some fucking principles, or don't get involved at all in these types of conversations, unless being used as a pawn is your thing. It's amazing to me how easy the average Joe lets himself be swayed around, pushed from one side to the other instead of building some character before jumping into political or ethical discussions. Makes sense when you see most countries exclusively having a two-party system. But anyway, I digress. I'll go back to the original question I was given. How is CA woke? They don't even have blacks. How the fuck can they not know? For starters, there are blacks and other minorities in the world of Warhammer Fantasy. There was a time when Games Workshop tried introducing different human cultures to their world, but they failed miserably with their version of Africans because instead of coming up with a solid and cool culture fans could fall in love with, all they did was toss in a caricature of the Pygmy people from Central Africa. The Warhammer Pygmies are almost a one-to-one representation of their real-life counterparts. Sure, they do have a warrior class, magic users, and chieftains, but they lack too much depth to be taken seriously. And let's face it, they lack a lot of good artwork and cool figures to the point they just look like a caricature. In modern times, Games Workshop has been accused of racism by progressives for these depictions. But if you do a little bit of research, it's easy to find out the style in which these African tribes were depicted in Warhammer look silly because they were made very early on in the lifespan of the Warhammer games back in the 80s. And if you dig in a bit more, you'll find out that every single faction and figure in Warhammer began as a caricature, sort of like a parody of The Lord of the Rings. The more serious and grim dark tone was a gradual process, but it wasn't the start. Who knows, maybe if progressives weren't such a pain in the ass, we could have had a really cool looking African faction in the Warhammer world. But alas. Another faction that represents a non-European culture in the world of Warhammer is, or rather was, Araby, obviously by its name inspired by North African and Middle Eastern cultures. Unlike the Pygmies, Araby was a faction that received a bit more attention. They were fleshed out over the years to the point where they evolved into the more serious version of Warhammer Fantasy we all know today. There's plenty of lore about them. they have plenty of history with existing factions such as Bretonia, the Empire of Man, Vampire Coast, Skaven, High Elves, and Tomb Kings, to name a few notable ones. They have a really cool lore, and their armies have a mixture of human warriors and magicians with their own lore of magic called Arabian elemental magic, and tame war monsters such as genies, flying carpets, and other spirits of the desert. It's a really cool faction that could very easily fit in the current lore of Warhammer Fantasy. So what's the problem here? Why can't this faction be fully fleshed out? Well, it turns out in the Games Workshop official lore, the peoples of Araby have one religion where they worship the one true God, aka Allah. I'm not kidding. It's actually named Allah. That's canon. And what's more, they also have a certain prophet known as the Prophet of Law, who is a really controversial figure in the lore itself. That is, by Arabian cultural standards. The Prophet of Law in the world of Warhammer is described as a religious fanatic, a radical that preaches an absolute message against all non-humans. This guy is such a loose cannon that even Teclis has to keep a close eye on him. Hopefully, everything I'm saying is pretty self-explanatory as to why Creative Assembly refuses to include these two factions in the game. The funniest thing is, whenever you see Warhammer fans from the Middle East, or any Islamic country for that matter, they all want Araby in the game. I never see a single word in protest, or even remote accusations of racism. As a matter of fact, whenever I do see them, they come from white people. The jokes write themselves. So how is CA woke? They don't even have blacks. Yes, they do. They could have blacks and other human cultures in the game, inspired by real world history if they wanted to, but they're too cowardly to include them for fear of a backlash. It goes back to the saying, when you're so woke, you do a full 360 and become racist all over again. That's the level of woke we're talking about. It doesn't help that Games Workshop included slavery as a fundamental part of the Pygmy and Araby cultures. The Pygmies being enslaved and often called lesser men by other cultures, and Araby doing the slaving. Does that mean Games Workshop is based or racist or whatever the fuck you want to call it? No. Originally, Games Workshop created every race and faction in their games based on historical cultures. And if you want to represent tribes from Africa in the game, you have to base them on historical facts, which is going to include all the wild shit they did to each other before the Europeans ever got there. In the same way, dwarves, elves, and all-world men are represented in the game with their own set of historical grievances against each other. But it's 2024. Modern media is all about rewriting history and replacing it with whatever the fuck sounds and feels good. So instead of representing these different world cultures with all their flaws and virtues, let's just have fucking Wakanda and call it a day. You cowards. And by the way, there's a continuation to the original question. How is CA woke? They don't even have blacks. And that is, there's even slavery in the game. Hopefully I've already answered these two questions in detail, but just to drive the point further, slavery exists in Warhammer not as a counter-woke culture jab, but as a way to represent real-world history, although turned to 11. But there's more to the debate I had with these Creative Assembly dick riders. Another point they used to defend CA from the woke stigma was they have hot characters in the game. They refer to specifically Morathi, the Dark Elf Queen. And yeah, sure, she is pretty hot. It's a pretty good character design, isn't it? Well, that's because she was not designed by Creative Assembly. Morathi is a Games Workshop original made 30 or so years ago. The character is as old as the entire Dark Elf race, because without her, there'd be no Dark Elves at all. And it's not like she's just designed to look hot for no reason. She's a Slanesh follower, a follower of the god of perversion in the Warhammer world. Of course she's gonna go around dressed like a slut. That's the whole point. She has sex with her own son, for fuck's sake. You think Creative Assembly is gonna have the balls to come up with those kinds of ideas? Fuck no. Every time the people I was arguing with brought up an example of a character that proved Creative Assembly wasn't woke, it turned out to be an original Games Workshop character. Characters that are bound by legal contracts to be represented with 100% accuracy. As a matter of fact, let's see what kind of original female characters Creative Assembly has given us. A fat old lady and a whole like Olga female warrior. Get the fuck out of here, man. They go through the ABCs of every woke red flag in gaming. But when confronted with these facts, you know what they respond with? Well, they haven't covered them up. Of course they haven't covered them up. If they did, they'd be breaking the lore in its entirety, which goes against the contractual deal they sign up with old school Games Workshop about recreating their characters identically as they are portrayed in the official lore. Moreover, pissing off Warhammer fans was a pretty bad idea back in 2017 when the game came out. Creative Assembly doesn't cover these characters up, not because they don't want to, they legally can't, which is why every original female design that comes from them looks like shit. They clearly have regulations in place for what kind of designs they can or can't do. Regulations laid out to increase their ESG rating, that is environmental, social and governance, or in other words, their woke rating. Another example I like to mention is how, when Creative Assembly had full creative freedom to expand the lore, they ended up coming up with gender-neutral armies for Cathay. So again, how's any of this not woke? I dread to think what kind of bullshit they'll pull next time when they have full creative freedom to create the kingdoms of Ind or Nippon. That is, the Warhammer versions of India and Japan. Creative Assembly has proven in the past that they're willing and able to push the message whenever and however they want if given free rein to the IP. And now that Games Workshop itself has gone fully woke, this will only get worse and worse. Keep in mind, if the leaks are true, they have Warhammer 40k lined up as a possible future Total War game. This might have sounded pretty exciting 10 years ago, but considering the current state of Creative Assembly and Games Workshop, this is gonna be terrible. Monkey's paw-wish levels of terrible. And what's worse, they'll keep normalizing their useless progressive politics to the point where people won't care anymore, or will be too scared to speak out and call their bullshit for what it is. The Emperor's new clothes in real life. Anyway, that's all I gotta say. Oh, but before I end the video, here's a quick review for the Shadows of Change DLC. CA, you fucking thieves. You added nothing of value to the roster of the three main factions the DLC was meant for. Cathay still lacks decent infantry and cavalry, and so does Kislev. And if the content for these two were next to nothing, whatever Zinj got is a joke. Even after the update, no way this crap is worth 25 bucks. All you did was add new monster units that don't add any depth to the gameplay and do nothing but break the game even further. Over half of all the factions need urgent reworks just to keep up with the bullshit you keep adding. As the game stands, buying Warhammer 2 and all its DLC is a fucking scam. And at the pace things are going, it's absolutely clear you have no intentions of fixing anything. 1 out of 10, fuck you too, CA. If I knew back in 2021 this is how the game was gonna end up, I wouldn't have bought anything in the first place. And that's all I gotta say. Thanks for listening. Bye.